here at Catalyst, we're about one thing, and that is loving people to life change in Christ. Life change in Christ. That's our purpose. That's our goal. So if you're here this morning, whether you're in the sanctuary or you're joining us online, I need you to understand that we love you, but I love you enough to tell you the truth, which is I don't want you to remain the same that you are. I love you enough to tell you that you're an image bearer of God, that Jesus died to forgive you, and part of that process is us changing to be more like him and less like the old us. And that's what we're going to do this morning. One of the ways that we do that is by studying his word together. Now this week we'll be continuing the sermon series we started last week called Summer in the Psalms. This is something I've wanted to do for a while. I feel like there's a ring in my mic. Something I've wanted to do for a while, which is dig into the book of Psalms. It's not something we always get to talk about at church and really find the richness and the beauty in there. So if you have your physical Bibles, literally just stick your finger into the middle and you will find the book of Psalms. If you're on your digital Bible, just tap where it says. So turn or tap with me to the book of Psalms. While you turn there, let me give you the key thought that's going to hold all of these sermons together. Here it is. The book of Psalms is ancient Hebrew lyrical poetry that expresses timeless relevance to anyone striving to live a life that honors God. The book of Psalms is ancient Hebrew lyrical poetry. Now, let me give you a couple basic ideas so you can understand where we're at in the book of Psalms. The Psalms was written by different authors over a period of 1,000 years. A lot of people think that like David wrote the book of Psalms. He wrote many of them, but he didn't write all of them. You can check to make sure your submix is also muted. So the Psalms were written by different authors over a period of 1,000 years. The earliest Psalm is probably written by Moses. Some of the later Psalms could have been written even after David into Solomon's time period. Also, if you've ever noticed reading in your English Bible, the Psalms don't rhyme. And I was never really good at English in high school. In fact, if my parents were here, they would tell you I failed English twice in high school because I don't do good at, honestly, the number one thing I failed in English is textual evaluation. Which is funny, Jim, that this is now what I do for a living, evaluating the Bible's text. But I was really, really bad at examining texts in high school. But the Psalms don't rhyme because ancient Hebrew lyrical poetry uses other devices that just rhyme to tell us what the point is. Number 3, the Psalms can be divided into 4 main categories. There are Psalms of praise. There are Psalms of actual songs. There are Psalms of lament. And there are imprecatory psalms. An imprecatory psalm, we'll get into one of those later, which is actually beseeching God for his judgment and justice on the sin that is done to his people. So those are probably the least popular psalms, unless you're having a bad day, and then you open them and you're like, David, yeah, get him, right? And then number 4, the book of Psalms, as we know it, was likely compiled after the exile period into its current form. And with that, let's review the big Bible story so we all know where we're at, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He made the Garden of Eden in which he placed Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve had 2 sons, Cain and Abel. That's right. Then they are out of the garden. Sin enters the world. Sin runs rampant. God needs to restart humanity. He sends a flood. Into that flood, he calls a man named Noah to build a boat named the Ark. How many human beings were on the Ark? 8. Correct. 8. Noah, his 3 sons, and each one of them had a wife. So there are 8 human beings on the ark. After the ark rests, humanity gets a restart. That's Genesis 9. Genesis 12, God picks one man from a place called Ur of the Chaldeans. And he says, listen, I want you to go to the land that I will show you. I'm going to be your God. You're going to be my people. I'm going to bless those who bless you. I'm going to curse those who curse you. I'm going to give you this land over here as an everlasting inheritance to your children. And when God changed this man's name, his name became Abraham. God repeats that covenant promise to one of Abraham's sons. Who is the covenant recipient that's Abraham's son? Isaac. God repeats the covenant promise again to one of Isaac's sons. Who's the covenant recipient after Isaac? Jacob. Then Jacob has a plethora of sons, and they become what we know as the 12 tribes of Israel. That gets us to the end of the book of Genesis. That's all just the first book of the Bible. Then, the children of Israel living in Egypt, they are enslaved by a Pharaoh who did not know what God did for them, and they cry out for a deliverer. And he sends them a man who grew up in Egypt and then worked for 40 years in Midian. His name is Moses. Moses and his brother Aaron and sister Miriam lead the children of Israel out of Egypt. They cross the Red Sea on dry ground, and they're supposed to go directly to the land of promise. That was the plan. And unfortunately, they had an obedience problem. So how many years do they wander in the wilderness? 40. 40 years wandering in the wilderness for an entire generation. The generation that experienced the 10 plagues of Egypt did not experience the promised land. Just let that sink in. You think you struggle to be faithful and follow God? You did not see fire and brimstone fall from heaven. We did not walk across the Red Sea, and then 40 days later they're worshiping the golden calf at Sinai. It's insane. So then we move into the land of Canaan. That's Joshua. That begins the Judges period, where Israel doesn't really have a king yet, and everyone does what is right in their own eyes. Then all of a sudden Israel gets jealous of all the nations around it. And what does Israel ask God for? A king. Ask God for a king. Who is supposed to be Israel's king? God himself. But they ask for a human king. And God says, okay, fine. You want a human king? I'm going to give you a human king. And he's going to marry your daughters. He's going to conscript your sons, and he's going to tax you. And who is the first king of the United Monarchy of Israel? Saul, that's right. Saul followed by David, followed by Solomon. And then after Solomon, what happens? Civil war. And this is the part of the Old Testament that a lot of people miss. After King Solomon, civil war happens, and the children of Israel are separated. And they stay that way for the rest of the Old Testament. The northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. How many tribes in the north? 10. And how many tribes in the south? 2. 12 minus 10 for those of you who are good at math. Right? Then they're two separate nations for several hundred years. They have some mostly bad kings. There's a couple good kings that call them back, but mostly bad kings. So now God has to take his people out of the promised land because he has to put them into timeout. And in 586 BC, what is the foreign nation that comes in and invades the northern kingdom of Israel? Assyria, that's right. Then Assyria falls to another foreign nation, Babylon. And then in 720, I think, BC, Babylon comes in, conquers Judah, and now all of God's people are carried away from the promised land. Over here, during the captivity, Babylon falls to what third pagan nation? Persia. During this period, the Babylon to Persia period, there's your book of Daniel, there's your book of Esther, Nehemiah, returning back home, Hezekiah. That's the end of the Old Testament. They move back into the land. That is when the book of Psalms is finally compiled. I know we do this every single week, but it's important so that when we dive into the scriptures, you can see the big timeline of where things take place. Even though Moses wrote one of the Psalms, even though David wrote a pretty good, hefty portion of the Psalms. Some of them are written by Solomon. Some of them are written by other authors, and some of them are unnamed who the author is. They aren't compiled into the collection that we're about to study until the exile period. And that's why I wanted you to go through that. So today we're going to look at Psalm 2. Finally, the other thing I need you to understand is the Hebrew concept of parallelism. So parallelism is when you repeat an idea in multiple ways for emphasis. In English, we might call that compare and contrast, right? You can't compare or contrast if you don't have more than one thing. If I'm comparing two things, I have two things. If I'm contrasting two things, I still have two things. So that's kind of what parallelism is. So first, let's read Psalm 2 together. And then I want to go back and sort of show you what the outline is, and then we'll examine it together. So here we go. Psalm chapter 2, starting in verse 1. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth rise up and the rulers band together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their chains and throw off their shackles. The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. He rebukes them in his anger and he terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. I will proclaim the Lord's decree. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have become your father. Ask me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. You will break them with a rod of iron. You will dash them to pieces like pottery. Verse 10, therefore, you kings, be wise, be warned. You rulers of the earth, serve the Lord with fear and celebrate his rule with trembling. Kiss his son, or he will be angry, and your way will lead to your destruction. For his wrath can flare up in a moment. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. Now, going through a psalm is not exactly like going through the Gospels or going through a narrative text where there's a setting and there's characters and there's action and there's, that's a little different. So first thing I want to do, and I don't think I put this on the slides, but I want to first tell you that this is a psalm written by King David. How do I know that? If you have your Bibles, turn to Acts chapter 4, verse 25. In the sermon delivered in Acts 4, the Holy Spirit tells us through that writer that this passage is written by King David. If you go back and look at the sermon, Acts 4:25. So this sermon identifies David as the author of this psalm. I'm also going to give you the basic outline of this sermon. Verses 1 through 3 present a problem. Verses 4 through 9 present the solution to that problem. And verses 10 through 12 present a warning based on the problem-solution paradigm. So you feel me there? So it's three basic sections. Verses 1 through 3 represent the problem, 4 through 9 represent a solution, and 10 through 12 represent a warning. So what is the problem? I'm sure this is going to come as a total shocker to everybody. Ready for this? The problem is the world is pointlessly opposed to God's plan. Right? I saw several of you blink your eyebrows at me. I'm sure that's really surprising. Just remember who wrote this. King David wrote this thousands of years ago. And he was frustrated that the world still, and I'll get into why I said pointlessly. So the problem is the world pointlessly opposes God's plan. The solution, the coming Messiah will be king of the world. And the warning, the coming Messiah will be savior and judge of the world. Now let me show you how I got there. So verse 1, why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? Do you see the parallelism there? That whole sentence is divided in half. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? Nations, the Hebrew word there is goy, and it literally means people groups or nations. So if David is the author and he is writing about the nations, he is describing Gentile nations. He's describing people groups that live outside of God's design. That's basically every Gentile nation in David's time. Now, today we could argue that that word might be more like the Greek word ethnos, where we get ethnic from. So there are people groups that aren't necessarily nations, right? Like my heritage, my people are Hawaiian. We're no longer a nation, but that doesn't make us not a people. We're still a people group. So in the New Testament, you could probably say that nations and people more or less aligned. But here, the Philistines are a group, but they're also a nation. The Canaanites are a group, but they're also a nation. So he's talking about the Gentile nations that live outside of or opposed to God's authority and rule. Also remember, in the time of David, God's people are not just a people group. They're a nation. The nation of Israel is the way that God has revealed himself all the way back at this time in salvation history. So when he is comparing, why do these nations, and notice he says here, why do they conspire and why do they plot in vain? Why do the Gentile nations, whether we're talking about the ones that existed in David's day, whether we're talking about the Rome existing in Jesus' day, or whether we're talking about the world powers that exist today in our day, why would their plotting or their conspiring, why would it all be in vain? Well, the simple fact is, the nations, even if they all band together, aren't more powerful than God. He's saying, why do the nations and the peoples plot in vain? And then he defines it here in verse 2. The kings of the earth rise up and the rulers band together. Notice again the parallelism. People, action, people, action. Kings of the earth rise up. Rulers band together. And what do? They rise up and band together against the Lord. Notice the capital letters. What does it mean? Every time you see Lord in capital letters, that is the English translators telling you that is the special covenant name for God, Yahweh. So if David is talking about foreign nations in comparison to God's chosen nation, and he uses God's covenant name, he's talking about the difference between Gentile authority that does not follow God and his authority as king, his nation, who does follow God. And what in verse 2 do? They rise up against the Lord and against his anointed. That word anointed in the Hebrew, Messiah. And guess what that sounds an awful lot like? Messiah. David is referring, now keep in mind, David lived, let's say, there's 2,000 years between Abraham and Jesus. So let's just cut it in the middle. And let's say David lived roughly 1,000 years before the birth of Jesus. David is a human being. Does David know that Jesus' name is Jesus? No. In fact, Jesus' name wasn't really Jesus. Jesus is an English word, and English as a language wasn't invented in the time that Jesus lived. Jesus' name was most likely Yeshua, which if we translated it straight to English would be Joshua, not Jesus, but because his name goes like through Latin and it takes a little back road and visits grandma's house and comes back, then it becomes Jesus over here. So he is referring to the Messiah in a future context. The same way that you and I would refer to the second coming of Jesus. We're looking to the future at it. We get the privilege, Aaron, we can look back in the Gospels, right? We've been talking about the Gospels in our emails. So we can look back at the Gospels and see Jesus' actions as the Messiah. David doesn't get that perspective. He is 1,000 years before Jesus, but he is looking forward to what the Messiah will do. And so in verse 2 here, that is absolutely a reference to Jesus, even though David could not have known the events that you and I know about the first century. He does have an expectation that there is a promised Messiah. The expectation of a promised Messiah goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, when God told Eve that one of her children would crush the head of the serpent. That's the very first reference to Jesus in all of the Bible, which we'll talk a little bit more about tonight, why that's important when we talk about creation and evolution. So verse 2, the kings of the earth, the rulers, they rise up, they band together against the Lord, Yahweh, and against his Messiah, Jesus. The world's system is always opposed to Jesus. Like, I don't think I'm saying anything super revelatory right now, right? Give me a minute, I'll try to get something good. But I think that's kind of obvious. What's cool about it is the fact, excuse me, David wrote this 3,000 years ago. The world system is always opposed to God's Messiah. So for 3,000 years, that's been true. Not just in our lifetime, not just in our parents' lifetime. The world is directly opposed to the rule of God. Verse 3, let us break their chains and throw off their shackles. Now verse 2 tells us that this sentence here in verse 3 is being spoken by the Gentile or world power, the world authority. And what are they saying? Let us break off the chains, throw off the shackles. What are they throwing off? Let us throw off our obedience to God, right? Because verse 2 tells us it's the kings of the earth, the rulers, together they band up against God, against the Messiah. And when they're banding against God, what are they saying? I want to break off their chains, throw off their shackles. I no longer want to be beholden to God's design or direction. Yeah, sounds an awful lot like the world we live in, just gotta say. Sounds an awful lot like a lot of the things I see on social media. I want to no longer be beholden to God's authority. Then, so that right there, that verses 1 through 3, that defines the problem, even from David's perspective. The world stands opposed to God and stands in rejection of his authority and his direction. And that's all the way back from David. Then, when we get to verse 4, now David's going to talk about the solution to that problem. What is the solution to a world that is in direct opposition and rejection of God's authority? Here it is. A coming Messiah is going to be king of the world. Watch this, verse 4. The one enthroned in heaven, who's that? That's God. The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs. You see the parallelism again, right? Two different references to God, two different references to his action. Why does God laugh and scoff at the Gentile nations who reject his authority? Because you can reject his authority all you want. It doesn't change his sovereignty. If I built the entire sandbox, doesn't matter what you do inside the sandbox still belongs to me. That's how my wife and I like to explain God's sovereignty. God built this giant sandbox we call a universe, and then he placed us inside the sandbox. And somehow we think that because we play in the sandbox that we can then say that there's no more God anymore. Because I'm free to go left or right or pick the sand up and throw it in somebody's face. That means there's no God. No, you still have to explain why the sandbox is there. So the one enthroned in heaven laughs, the Lord scoffs. Why? Because it doesn't matter how much Gentile disobedience takes place on planet Earth, it never rules out God's sovereign authority. Verse 5, he rebukes them in his anger, he terrifies them in his wrath. The word rebuke literally means to speak or to promise. What is God's rebuke? What is God's promise to fixing the problem of a world that doesn't want to obey him? Here it is in verse 6. What is God's solution? I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. What David is saying is God's solution to the world rejecting his sovereign authority is God is going to send a king who will be king of the whole world. Now keep in mind, David is writing this. I can't tell you for certain when David wrote it. I can't tell you if David wrote it during his shepherding years. Did he write it during his mighty men soldiering years? Did he write it during his anointed king years? Did he write it during his sin with Bathsheba years? Did he write it in his old age when Solomon was already starting to rule years? I don't know. There's a lot of different stages to the life of David. That would be like a fun sermon series in and of itself, just watching how many different faces this one dude has. And yet he's the guy who was after God's own heart. What I can tell you is David absolutely saw a coming Messiah and King who will bring the disobedient and sinful world back under God's authority. See, as king of Israel, David understood that his authority came from God. Did you know that the kings of ancient Israel had to write their own copy of the law, word by word? They had to have their own copy, handwritten. They had to sit there and copy it for themselves, so they were intimately aware of God's expectations of them and his nation. So David understands that his authority as king comes from God. Furthermore, David understands here in verse 6, I have installed. God, all of his sovereign authority, has installed his chosen king on his holy mountain. God's solution to the problem of a world of sin and disobedience is the promise of a king who will rule the world. And what does that mean? It means a king who will rule the world and bring it back into submission to his will and design. I know that's not the way we often talk about Jesus, right? We often talk about Jesus and he's like the cuddly Jesus. And he's the Jesus who goes after the lost sheep. And he's the Jesus who says, he who cast the first, he has not sinned, cast the first stone. We talk about Jesus in these amazingly loving terms because he is. But his mission is to bring the world back into submission to God's rule. When did that go out of whack? Genesis 3, when sin entered the world. The world started rejecting God's authority. What was the original sin? The serpent tempted Eve by questioning what God said. He didn't really say that. Did he really say that? What's funny is, if you read Genesis 3, Eve repeats back to the serpent exactly what God did say. She knew it. She knew what God said. And she and Adam still chose to reject God's authority. And by the time we reach here in the life of David, David is just frustrated as mess that there's now whole nations, whole people groups that just abjectly reject God's authority. God's love for humanity, let me say this. God is love. Absolutely. But God's love for humanity does not erase his abject hatred for sin. God's love for you does not excuse your sin. If we're going to talk about a God that is truly loving, you must also see a God that is truly just. And Jesus' ultimate goal in coming back, look at this, verse 7. I will proclaim the Lord's decree, he said to me. You are my son, today I have become your father. This line is repeated in the New Testament by Gabriel before Christ's birth in Luke 1:32, at Jesus' baptism in Luke 3:22, and confirmed after Jesus' resurrection in Acts 13:33. I know I spit those out really fast. Ask me on your Connect card, I'll send you all the notes. But this comment, you are my son, is repeated before Jesus' birth about Jesus, is repeated at Jesus' baptism about Jesus, and is repeated after his resurrection about Jesus. But it was said here first, 1,000 years earlier, by King David. He's talking, so David is speaking in the future tense. Guys, I know, oh my gosh, the Philistines are so aggravating. Their practices are so disgusting. Listen, just hold on. God will send us a king. He hasn't said it yet. And guess what? He may not even send it in my lifetime. But God's love is so true and his justice is so pure that he will send a king. And that coming king will make the world right. So hold on. Stay faithful. And that was 3,000 years ago when David was complaining about the Philistines. Not yesterday when your neighbor's complaining on Facebook. Verse 8. Ask me. Now this is Jesus. This is God speaking to the Messiah figure from David's perspective. Ask me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. There will not be a limit to Christ's authority when he returns. See, he came first as the suffering servant of Isaiah. And I know we already studied Revelation, for those of you who are here for that. When he comes back, he is coming back as a conquering king. He is not coming back as a gentle shepherd. He is coming back to bring the justice that has been waited for this long. I know there's a picture of Jesus in the book of Revelation, and it describes the hem of his garment is covered in blood. And in our Christian mentality, we think, oh, well, the hem of the wrist, it's got the blood from where he died for me. No, that's not it at all. We're talking about the hem of his garment down here at his ankles. Why is the hem of his ankles soaked in blood? The number of corpses that he is walking over, muting out God's justice on sin. Like when Jesus comes back, he is coming back to fix this problem, that we live in a world that is so broken and so out of design from the way it was originally made that we need a king who will bring it back into submission. A king that is also fully righteous and fully loving and fully merciful. But there comes a time when all this unrighteous mess has to get answered for. If not, then there's no hope. If there's no return, Aaron, we're just stuck. I'm just stuck with all this mess. I'm just stuck with all this evil. I'm just stuck with all this sin. There's no good ending to the story. No, the good ending to the story is the king returns. That's the good end of the story. But for all those people and those nations in verse 1 that plot in vain, that reject his authority, he's going to be a terrifying return. That's why the gospel is so important. Because I'll tell you this, when the king comes back, I'm going to be excited. Because the king's coming back not only to fulfill all these promises, but he's coming back to take that which is broken in our world and put it back to that which was right. That's why if you've ever read, those of you who love big story pictures, read the first 2 chapters of the Bible. Just the first 2, Genesis 1 and 2. And then skip everything in the middle and read the last 2 chapters of Revelation. They're like the bookends on the whole Bible. It's only these 4 chapters in the whole Bible. These 4 chapters are the only 4 where humanity has the correct relationship with God that he intended. In Genesis 1 and 2, we had a creation that was very good, that was free of sin, where God walked in the garden, where we were in his presence and were whole. And then sin happens in 3, and then the rest of the Bible plays out, and then Revelation plays out, and then it's not until the last 2 chapters that we get back to being in right relationship with God. All of that, and we went through it in Revelation, all that scary stuff, let me put it to you this way. My mother died of cancer, right? Just so that we're all clear, because I'm going to use cancer as an analogy, and I'm not trying to be insensitive. My life has been abjectly changed by the presence of cancer. Before her passing, my mother had several surgeries to try to remove the cancer, which is pretty standard operating procedure now, but it wasn't in 1989. That's because I'm an old person, okay? Sorry, Ethan, I'm old. Nobody looks at the doctor who's performing the surgery to remove the cancer as a bad guy. You know who's the bad guy? You know whose perspective the cancer doctor's the bad guy? The cancer. That's who the cancer doctor's the bad guy. The surgeon removing the tumor is performing a violent act, and it's gory and it's difficult and it requires medicine and it requires recovery. But nobody looks at the surgeon like he's evil. The action that he's doing is for the benefit of the body. When Jesus comes back to remove sin, yes, it's going to be violent. Yes, it's going to be bloody. Yes, it's going to be hard. But it is for the benefit of the planet. It is for the benefit of creation. Nobody argues that the cancer surgeon is the bad guy because we know that removing the cancer is good for the body. In the same way, the return of the king is not bad. Even though he has to remove sin and those who chose sin, it is for the benefit of his creation that we get to be free from the cancer of sin. And all of that is what he's saying right here. So when I read verse 9, and this is going to sound tough to a modern day Christian, it's going to suck. You will break them with a rod of iron. You will dash them to pieces like pottery. He is talking about all the stuff that we got to read in Revelation. Because keep in mind, that was all written in the future from David's perspective. He just knows that when Jesus comes back to win. From David's perspective, he cannot see the first coming of Jesus. So those of you who ever seen a picture of a mountain range, right? When you're looking at a picture of a mountain range like this, and you can see this peak, and you can see this peak, that's what the Old Testament looks like looking into the New Testament. They can see that this is going to happen, and they can see that this is going to happen. They can't see the amount of time between the two events. That's what the Old Testament is like when it looks forward to the events of the New Testament. They can see that there's a coming king, and they can see that that coming king is going to rule the earth. They can't see that those two events are separated by a certain amount of time. That's the best way I can explain why are some Old Testament prophecies fulfilled and some not fulfilled. Because from their perspective, they're just looking at the peaks. They can't see the valleys in between the mountains. So here, when verse 8, ask me, I will make your nations inheritance. The ends of the earth will be your possession. That's the extent of Jesus' rule. 9, you will break them with a rod of iron. You will dash them to pieces like pottery. This is God's solution to the disobedience of the world. Send a king who can bring it back in control. And then we get to the third part of the psalm, which is 10 through 12. This is the warning. So David's given us the problem. David's described the solution. And now here we get to the warning. The coming Messiah will be Savior and Judge of the world. Verse 10. Therefore, right? You feel that? All of a sudden now we're going somewhere. Because of this, therefore, you kings, meaning those of you who are in authority, those of you who are in power or influence large groups, you be wise, be warned, you rulers of the earth. Parallelism, right? Kings be wise, rulers be warned. Verse 11, serve the Lord. Now this is the part of the Old Testament a lot of people don't get. Everybody likes to say, well, the Old Testament God was judgy and mean and the New Testament God was loving. No. Any Gentile person in the Old Testament could place their faith in the God of the Jews and convert. Keep in mind, Abraham was a Gentile before God called him. Like Paul gets into that in Romans. Everybody likes, oh, we're children of Abraham. Abraham was chosen. Abraham was chosen while he's a Gentile, bro. We don't get to Hebrews until much later. So serve the Lord, serve Yahweh, the covenant name. What is he saying? If you are in the Gentile groups that are in rebellion to God, you can choose to submit and serve him. That word serve also means to worship him, right? What did Moses say to Pharaoh? Let my people go so that they may worship me. It's the same word as serve. Hebrew doesn't make a distinction between worship and service. That's a whole different sermon for a whole other day. So, Gentile people in rebellion, serve the Lord with fear and celebrate his rule with trembling. What does it mean? Worship God and put yourself in obedience to him. That's verse 11. This is the solution. This is the warning. All of you rulers of the earth, Gentiles living in rebellion, worship God, submit yourself to him. Verse 12. Kiss his son. The kiss in an Old Testament, remember, we're talking about David, right? David's writing. Anybody ever seen a movie where, like, you have somebody in authority and they hold their hand out like this? What do? Kiss the ring, right? Whether we're talking about the Pope or we're talking about, like, Godfather, doesn't really matter to me. Just kiss the ring. What is the kiss the ring a symbol of? It's a symbol of submission, right? It's I'm going to follow you. I'm going to do what you say, right? So when he says kiss his son, this is kind of doubling down on all of verse 11, worship and submit. 12, kiss his son, worship and submit. Or why? Or he will be angry and your way will lead to destruction. When this new king who's going to come, from David's perspective, when this new king who is going to come, he is going to give you the choice. Submit or be destroyed. That's the point. And that's not meant to be harsh. I know when I'm online and I see lots of atheists or non-believers, and they go, man, the Christian message is just brutal. It's follow me or die. And I say, but you're only looking at part of it. It's you're sick and you're going to die. Take this medicine or death is coming anyway, right? When you rephrase, all of a sudden the gospel, because they don't like the whole follow me or die part, sounds super crazy. Why do you need to follow me? Because you have a poison within you that is killing you and you don't even know it. And I'm offering you free medicine to free you from that poison. Amen. That's the gospel message. But for those who do not take the medicine and don't get cured from the problem, the bigger problem is creation itself, the entire world, is out from God's design. And then look how the whole thing ends. The last sentence of verse 12. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. The first sentence. What is the group of people in the very first sentence of verse 1? Why do the nations? The whole focus has been those outside of God's covenant name. And then you get to the last sentence. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. David understood that the coming Messiah king who will bring the entire world into submission wasn't just going to flat kill all Gentiles. Any Gentile who would submit to God's rule would be brought into the kingdom and would be saved. That exists in the Old Testament law. It existed in David's day. We could go back, we just did the whole book of Ruth, right? Rahab, outsider, placed her faith in God, saved her entire family. Rahab has Boaz. Boaz gets to Naomi and Ruth. Then all of a sudden, Obed, Jesse, David, right? The Old Testament is filled with examples of outsiders who placed their faith in God and were brought into the kingdom. So this idea that Gentile salvation is a New Testament issue is really flawed. God has always wanted a creation of people who will worship him and submit to him. And David's observations in this psalm are the whole world is out of whack. But it's not going to be that way forever. Just pump the brakes. Have a little patience. Just wait. God is going to send a king who will fix the world's rebellion problem.